Thank you so much for joining us on Monash Connections for Change today. We're really thrilled to have you.
I'm rapt to be joining you. It's a very special opportunity. Thank you.
No worries. Kate, would you mind just telling us a little bit about yourself and what you do, what your work involves?
Yeah, I'm a qualified real estate agent and I work with buyers. So I'm a buyer's advocate and, as you said, a property investment advisor. So the dominant portion of clients that I work with are investors. We talk through strategy. I help them with the acquisition. And a lot of people think of advocates as those people that stand up and bid at auction. That's exactly what I do, but there's a lot behind the scenes as well.
You want to bust a few myths that around property and the investment market and what we're hearing about what's happening during COVID.
Unfortunately, bad news sells. I don't think a positive news story will get the papers selling like a bad news story will. And of course, there's always commentary that people can, twist or put their own impression on. And we saw the 30% claim evolve when CommSec came out with some ideas around how serious COVID could impact our market. And there were clustered predictions based on the severity of how we dealt with our numbers. And the 30% was worst case. And of course, that was the headline that hit the media. I've enjoyed busting myths for a long time. I've been looking critically at media reports since the GFC when it comes to the property industry. And this time round was no different. We saw some horrendous headlines. And the 30% is a giant myth. I've chatted to many people about what actually happened at the coalface. And of course, the pandemic struck on Friday the 13th of March. And I had an auction on the 14th. And the evening prior, my clients wanted to have a chat. They were a little bit nervous. We all knew that this virus was out there, but they were concerned about their investment in the property market. And they downgraded their budget a little bit to the point where I wasn't super confident that we'd have success, but I went along anyway. I had already ascertained that I'd be up against 3 other bidders. And interestingly, I really only had one person in the contest, and the property passed into me. We went inside. We got it for a price that was a little under what I thought we'd get it for, which was the first time I thought, yes, this will filter through. People are nervous. And from that day, for the following 3 weeks, things did get pretty hairy and it felt awful. Buyer interest just disappeared. Vendors were nervous, particularly the vendors that were caught in the crossfire and had to sell. They didn't have an option to put their campaign on hold. And we saw price falls up to about 12% in Melbourne, and it was a very tight time frame. I've created a chart that matches my acquisitions along the case numbers line. So as our curve started to flatten and our new cases slowed down, confidence came back into the market, which is human behaviour. That's what people do. When things look better, they get back out there and spend money. And during the depths of despair, which was when the case numbers were at the highest and news out of Italy and Spain was scary, we were picking up some properties for 10 to 12% discounts. Once the curve started to flatten, the discounting really slowed down, and within 3.5 weeks, by the time we got to Easter weekend, there were no more discounts. So it's a telling curve, and unless we have unforeseen issues going forward with our case numbers, I think that was the most severe point that we can anticipate seeing, because we now have confident buyers out there. Obviously, we have concerns about unemployment, and we'll have other segments of the market that won't want to get out there and purchase, but we've currently got a supply issue. We've got more buyers than sellers, and at this stage, that supply-demand imbalance is putting a bit of a floor under price falls.
There's obviously going to be potential for growth and opportunities. In any situation, it goes both ways. Are you seeing any evidence of that sort of change?
We've had recent announcements that lenders will start assessing borrowers a little differently to what we've been getting accustomed to over the last 5 years. We had a directive from APRA from 2014 that really heightened in 16 onwards, that had lenders assessing borrowers with a lot of scrutiny, and so getting money was hard. And we had a credit squeeze which drove our last economic downturn before COVID. And now that we've had this legislative change put back onto the agenda, and the the word on the street is that by March, all things going through, we'll have credit availability in a more bountiful supply than what we've been experiencing for the last few years. So that is already earmarked to offset some of the things that people have been concerned about with JobKeeper ending and any fallout there. But also we have seen other opportunities through this. We've certainly seen first home buyers getting preferential treatment. They've had opportunities through grants, concessions, shared equity schemes, and also aid with their deposit, so avoiding the lender's mortgage insurance with some government-backed deposit assistance. So they've really had a bit of an easier experience out there. And in addition, when it comes to credit treatment, typically a first home buyer will have a less messy kind of, fiscal outlook there, because they don't carry the same amount of debt that an investor or an upgrader applicant might. So they tend to go through the lending approval process a lot smoother as well. And I think that their opportunities will definitely continue, but they'll be contending with investors next year, that's for sure. In terms of some of the opportunity through COVID and some of the changes that we're seeing, we've definitely seen a bit of a move into the regions, and I know that we'll chat about that going forward. But there certainly is opportunity there for anyone who has their finance in order and is able to press the go button, while some people are still standing back and feeling fearful.
A lot of stories about people taking advantage of working from home, looking to embed that in their lifestyle perhaps more deeply in a post-COVID world. So are you seeing an increase, obviously, in people looking to move to the regions, but also are you seeing any changes in the kind of properties people are looking for? Has COVID had an impact on how people want to live now?
It definitely has, and it's taken all of us by surprise. We're privy to the search terms that consumers pop into search engines when they're doing their searching online, and things like larger kitchen, study, the amount of requests for additional study space or dedicated study is enormous, and people are pushing back on the apartment style dining out lifestyle. They're actually wanting to have an entertainer's kitchen. So rather than a galley kitchen with the kitchen against a wall in a tight apartment, they're pushing back against that. We're also seeing a desire for dual living spaces. Anyone who has had to work professionally at home while homeschooling will be craving having their own space for, conducting Zoom meetings and just being able to hold it together and have the kids elsewhere. So the changes that we've seen are enormous. And what that has done in turn, particularly when we think about value for money, is it's pushed people out of the city, because it doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand that the price tag that you'll need to come up with to stay in the same neighbourhood and have a much larger property is substantially higher, and sometimes it's something that people can't consider. So the idea of switching to another city or moving further out is not lost on people. We've had an enormous upswing in inquiry for the regions, whether it be Castlemaine, Bendigo, Ballarat, Geelong, the Surf Coast, the Peninsula. People are happy to consider moving out, and usually their distance to the CBD that they nominate is anything between 75 minutes and 2 hours. So we've got people who are prepared to be 2 hours out of town, occasionally come in on the train and broadly set up working from home. It's been a significant change.
If we're seeing a reduction in the CBD, how do you think that's potentially going to have an impact, for example, say commercial rents or on retail spaces in the CBD?
I don't think we'll see a mass exodus from our city. I think for the time being, it's been a difficult period for everyone, and Melbourne doesn't feel the same while we're all in lockdown. But there'll be those that thrive on the idea of the city, and we've certainly got those that need to be in the office, and whether it's because they have interaction with their co-workers, or they work in pods, or they have to physically be there to do their job. I don't think that we'll see this exodus that leaves a ghost town. I do feel fearful though for any landlords that are trying to rent offices or small apartments, because we do have a lesser demand for offices. And what we have seen a lot of large businesses doing is reconsidering their needs And if they're downscaling their office needs or thinking about moving just out of town and having, an inner ring suburban office, that they're some of the challenges that city landlords are facing, and rents will obviously reflect that as we come out of this. But in terms of apartments, we've definitely seen a swing in preferences. So the small one better is not so exciting unless it's someone's bolt hole. They're enjoying having a city pad and they've got their coastal property. We've seen a little bit of that, but our most significant issue with our small apartments in town is that we haven't got overseas students and we've got less overseas investors. So the oversupply is a problem. It will continue to bite, and I think developers will get savvy about constructing more boutique style, lock and leave, retiree type properties in the inner ring. I think that's where, for the time being, the profits are for developers.
So I wanted to ask you about how things are working out for landlords. We've been seeing a lot of very black and white sort of stories about landlords versus tenants in this situation where there's had to be, a rent freeze for some people. What's your experience with how that scenario is playing out, given you work with these people
Yes.
on a daily basis?
It spooked a lot of prospective investors completely. They've put their plans on hold because they can envisage holding a property and having a tenant that decides not to pay. The first thing that I want to say is that the broad number of tenants who have been impacted to the degree where they've asked for a rental reduction has generally been circa 12%. So I've interviewed, depending on the location, some have been higher because they've been in a higher risk area, others have been lower. But if we circle 12%, that means that it's broadly, 1 in 9 are coming forward saying, I need some help. Now, the first thing is that number. The second thing is the nature of the landlords. And people have, a greedy, gruesome landlord in their head when they're reading the paper. But the reality is that a large proportion of investors only own one property. So more than 50% of investors are just one property owners, and they're typically mum and dad investors, and their motivation for investing might be to have a nest egg for their kids or to have more to rely on in their retirement than just their super balance. Or they could be self-employed, and that is actually what they're putting their super into. So we're not talking about greedy, gruesome monsters that don't care for their tenants. And in every situation where we had a past client coming back saying, look, I've encountered this, my property manager said that the tenant needs some relief, what do I do? They've been beautiful about it. They've been concerned about the tenant's welfare. They've naturally been nervous about their own ability to meet their repayment obligations, but it has been a conversation between them and the tenant via the property manager. And in every single instance, the landlords have all been willing to work out something that's fair and reasonable. And it is important to say that aside from the initial days where this news broke and poor property managers didn't have a manual on what to do when a pandemic hits, they got their head around it very quickly. They implemented policies, they worked with the REIV and Consumer Affairs and detailed a really good approach. And then the government stepped in and said, well, we can subsidise some of this, and there are processes in place now. So when a tenant does hit hardship, they have to go about it in a documented and regimented way. And then the landlord considers the issue. For some, the tenants are happy just to have rental reduction or pause until they can repay it, and for others they're negotiating a full reduction that's permanent and binding that doesn't have them repaying that portion. And I haven't seen any horror stories with my clients. I think that the secret to this is communication, but the encouraging thing is that after the first 7 to 10 days when tenants were impacted, we've had very few cases since then. So it hit like a landslide and then it petered out. And once agreements were in place, it certainly gave everyone a lot of comfort and peace of mind. So yes, the media have certainly hammed it up, but we're talking about a small proportion. And since then, even with an inability to inspect in person, we've had really tight vacancy rates in our city, and we've seen rental uptake in the inner and middle rings still being relatively strong. So what that says is we still have insufficient properties for tenants because there is tenant competition at the moment.
What do you think the areas of most risk and most opportunity are going to be in the property market going forward in a sort of post-COVID, COVID normal world?
Yeah, I think people latching onto something, all jumping onto it because everyone else is doing it, can be dangerous. There's obviously been a lot of heat in the regions. We've seen some really interesting price gains. In fact, the regions have outperformed our capital city in Victoria. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's lasting. I think there are some people that will move out to the country and they'll make it work and they'll love it. They'll never regret the decision. There are others that are doing it because it feels like the right thing to do right now, while COVID is making our city feel pretty miserable, but they may well reverse their decision. So for some, it's a wonderful permanent change, and for others, it's a fad. So I would say to anyone who's not certain about the area they're thinking of moving to, try it before you buy it. Pop a tenant in your house in the city, go and rent in the country and see how you feel, because the regions aren't meant to outperform our city in terms of capital growth long term. We'll always see data bucking the trend for a short period of time, but when we're talking long term, Melbourne should outperform. I think the other areas of concern are small apartments. We've really got to think about how COVID has permanently changed our preferences, and I think we've all learnt how to enjoy the simple things in life. And we've also seen an appreciation of home cooking and being together inside. So I think we have to put a bit of weighting against good internal facilities and our ability to entertain. In terms of long-term performance, I think that the fundamentals will always support property that is well located, has great amenity and is in scarce supply. So all of the inner established areas I still hold up as a great example of a really good investment opportunity. And I'm still very cautious about the fringe areas, because house and land type areas are usually appealing to people for affordability reasons, not necessarily because they're excited about the scarcity or the opportunity. So just remembering what drives emotional purchasing is really important for an investor, because you want to purchase something that one day a lot of people will be emotional about putting their hand up for at auction.
That is such excellent and practical advice. Kate, thank you so much for your time today on Connections for Change. We've absolutely really appreciated you coming, and that was just a fantastic chat with lots of really useful and helpful information for us.
I'm so pleased. Whoever thought my real estate experience would bring me back to Monash, but I'm very grateful. Thank you.